Thank you, everybody, for coming here for our final conversation in what has been, I think, a really interesting, for me, intellectually stimulating and challenging week. My first kind of question to you, Daniel, or perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this book you've just published, about your experience as Dean in Shandong, and about the experience that it reflects on. I was really curious about why on earth you wanted to work as a minor bureaucrat, as you say, for a Chinese university in this kind of increasingly restrictive climate in China that we've been talking about throughout this week. And I was wondering, was your experience as you had expected when you took on this role? And what do you hope that your book will achieve in talking about this experience to a broader audience?
Well, thank you so much, Astrid. And I'm sorry that I missed the past week. It sounds wonderful. I don't have to tell everybody here that it's very grim times. And however bad things are in China, we should remember that, things are much worse elsewhere. And just at the level of basic commitment, I mean, there's no dispute in China about commitment to very basic human rights, like don't kill innocent people, don't torture people, slavery is bad, genocide's bad. I mean, we can argue that there's a gap between the ideal and the practice like elsewhere, but at least on those very basic human rights, I think there's a consensus between China and the West, if I can use those sweeping categories. The really where there is a dispute is what is the best way of selecting and promoting public officials. But anyway, let me try to answer, or not to answer, but to discuss three of the points. One thing that was raised by Astrid, I mean, one thing that I learned as a public official in China, especially a university administrator, is when we give speeches, we usually stick to 3 points, because they say it's 1 or 2 is like too superficial, 4 is unlucky number, and once it's 5 or 6, you start losing your audience. So let me stick to 3 points, and if I speak too long, feel free to cut me off using legalist methods if need be. So what are the 3 points? I mean, the first is, again, the 3 questions that were raised just now too. Why I wrote this book, why on earth I would want to serve as dean, and 3, maybe what I learned as dean. And then maybe after that, we can discuss the rise of the Confucian and communist traditions. Well, why I wrote the book? I mean, so this book is an account of my experience as dean, and arguably it is a very unique experience. As you can tell, I'm not ethnic Chinese. I'm born and bred in Montreal, where I happen to be now. And it was a unique opportunity to serve as public official in a leading university. It is the leading university in Shandong province. It's a province of 100 million people. Shandong University is the leading university. And by the way, it's actually because of the kind of reverse affirmative action that there is for the national examination, university entrance examination system, the Gaokao. It's actually harder if you're from Shandong to get into Shandong University than if you're from Beijing to get into Tsinghua or Beida. But anyway, so it's a great university. And it was big faculty of political science and public administration, over 1,000 students and 80 professors, and I had a unique experience, and I think stories to tell that not just so much about me, but that shed light on Chinese academia and the political system. So that's what I tried to do. And so arguably, though, I wasn't so successful as dean, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I did want to write this book to help, to basically to thank, as a way of thanking my fellow public officials and teachers and students at Shandong University, precisely because I feel that I didn't do what I set out to do in the beginning, but maybe this book is a kind of thank you note. I should say that this book that was mentioned earlier, the China model, it's not a defense of the status quo. It was widely misunderstood. It's a defense of a political ideal, which I call political meritocracy in Chinese, 贤能政治, which is the idea that the political system should aim to select and promote public officials with above ability and virtue. And then I had one chapter, what are the key traits for those public officials? And I argued, and this is based on my experience, at Tsinghua University, where people argued about how to select public officials and how to assess them. There wasn't much talk about one person, one vote. So I thought it's interesting to try to systematically write about that. So one chapter was, well, what are the key traits? And at higher levels of government in a big country like China, again, it's China specific. It's not meant to generalize to the rest of the world. At higher levels of a big country of government in a big country like China, the leaders have to have above average analytical ability because the issues are so empirically complex, right? You have to have good knowledge of economics, of international relations, of history, of philosophy, of psychology, environmental science. That's one thing. And also one thing that I learned as dean is what do we do most of the time? It's in Chinese, we say kai hui, meeting after meeting after meeting. So we spend most of our time in long meetings trying to persuade others of our points of view and also revising our points of view in response to critical engagement. So to do that well, you have to have above average EQ or emotional intelligence. You have to read people well, know who's talking, why they're saying this, who might be behind them, and that sort of, and you have to consider different perspectives. So if you're an academic, say if you have tenure, especially, it doesn't matter if you have high EQ or not, you just do your work fine. But to be a public official, especially in a Chinese context, you have to have high level EQ. And by the way, a little footnote, the party secretary, Shu Ji, at mid-levels of administration, like at Shandong University, have very high EQ. And often it's strange, what they do when they retire, and this is empirically demonstrated, they often become therapists because the same sorts of skills that are useful in therapy are also, those are the same sorts of skills that party secretaries have most of the time. Anyway, finally, you need above average virtue because you need to be at least partly committed to serving others, not just committed to serving yourself or your family members, i.e. don't be corrupt and be at least partly committed to serving the public good. But what I realized, and what was missing, and it's only through my experience serving as dean that I realized this, you have to have a very, very great stamina, ability to work hard. I mean, as a public official in China, you're never on break, including university official, always through WeChat. If you don't respond within 10 minutes, people think there's something wrong. And when there's crises like during COVID, my fellow leaders, except for me, and this is part of my failure, live full time on campus dealing with these issues. So you have to have a great work ethic. And this is what I would say as a fourth quality that I only learned from my experience for public official in China. You have to have tremendous stamina. It turns out if you look at Chinese history, well, some of the very successful public officials in the past, like in the Qing dynasty, there's one called Qian Hongmo, and there's a biography of him, a very good one. He wasn't a great original thinker, but he was famous for his work ethic, for his strong stamina. That's really important. So anyway, I wrote this book partly to thank my leaders, because we can argue sometimes they weren't always doing the right thing, but one cannot be questioned is there this unbelievable work ethic. So this book is part of the way of thanking them. I also have a political agenda, and I'm very frank in the book that I worry very much about the demonization of China. I realize in this week you've had very diverse views, but at least in the mainstream, I'm going to use this sound polemical Western media, and in discourses in Canada, where I'm from, it's so obvious, in the US as well. It tends to be what people know about China is just, repression in Xinjiang, national security law in Hong Kong, people encouraged to spy on each other. That's the basic view. Now, when I speak to relatives in Montreal, that's pretty much all they know about China. So China is much more complex, obviously, and we need a more nuanced and balanced understanding. And I thought that I could write a book that shows the kind of humane and often humorous side of China. So the subject matter is very serious, bureaucracy, Confucianism, communism, but I use a kind of lighthearted approach to discuss those topics. So even the cover of the book, it has a bunch of emojis which represent the different chapters. It expresses a lighthearted approach to the book. Now, was I successful? I mean, now that I read this, I think it's how can I be so pompous to even think that a little book like this could make a difference on this countering these big trends, and we can discuss why that's happening. So that said, I mean, some of the, especially the kind of center-right media, I think has kind of picked up on the book a little bit. For better or worse, the center-right media I find is a bit more open to controversial voices. So even the real Uber hawks, you know, who have read the book say, well, at least it's entertaining. So anyway, that said, I don't want to portray myself as, I do want to portray myself as a kind of middle ground here. And I know it's common to say there's two extremes on middle ground, but I mean, here I can support it with some evidence. So all my other books have been translated in Chinese. This one has not been translated. No publisher will touch it in mainland China. That said, in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong University Press will do a Chinese version. Hong Kong has much more academic freedom if you deal with mainland Chinese politics compared to mainland China. Not if you deal with Hong Kong politics, because national security law, the boundaries are unclear. So if you want to deal with Hong Kong politics, Hong Kong is not a good place to be. Just like in Singapore, if you want to work in Singapore politics, not a good place. But mainland Chinese politics, it's a good place to be. More surprisingly, even the English, so Princeton University Press has an office in Beijing. They promote all their English language books, but mine was banned initially. Again, because I just so many politically sensitive topics. The longest one is on censorship. But finally, they pushed and pushed and got it approved, but with an official stamp. I don't know if you could see. Basically, it's an official stamp saying that the book is not officially approved. So and we don't know who is the official behind it. It's a beautiful solution where I served as a public official of political science. So really, in some sense, it's a kind of formal post in the bureaucracy. And I wrote this book, I think, in a balanced way. But if things go wrong, the relevant officials don't take responsibility, but they'll allow it to circulate. So it's a nice little solution. So why I served as dean? Well, three reasons. One, very quickly, I mean, as was mentioned, I had written on this ideal of political meritocracy, and I was offered an opportunity to learn about the bureaucracy from the inside. So it's a wonderful and unique opportunity. And I did learn many things, which I can get into. I've already discussed one, how the relevant qualities for leaders. And so that's one reason. I wanted to learn how the system works from the inside, and much of the book is about that. You know, how academic meritocracy works, how the Department of Organization works, the Zhongzhibu at the bureau at the levels of the university, how censorship works. It's much more sophisticated than we might think, and so on. I also I was hired by a party secretary called Kong Shuji. He had first invited me to Qingdao. So the campus of Shandong was in Jinan, but we wanted to build a new campus in Qingdao. And he invited me there about 15 years ago. And he said, we're going to have a new campus here. He brought me there. All I could see was cornfields. And I said, well, very interesting. Let's talk in a few years. Sure enough, 5 years later, beautiful campus was built right on the coast. And I described some of the buildings and the natural scenery and so on. Stunning campus built within 5 years. And my building it's also part of the law faculty. And they said, this year, you're going to be your building. And you have the task of doing what, though? Well, he is a party secretary, but he's also a 76th generation descendant of Kongzi, of Confucius. You may know in Shandong, in Chufu, that's the kind of home ground of Confucianism. In Shandong province, there's also a Confucian cemetery called the Kongling, and it's a great honor. It's a 2,500-year-old family tree to be able to be buried in that cemetery. So he said, you can help us promote Confucianism because you had written about Confucianism. He knew, of course, that I'm not a party member, right? I don't think any foreigner has been a party member, as far as I know, since the revolution. But you can try to help to promote Confucianism, which I realized early on is much more difficult than I thought. For one thing, it's very hard to change the educational curriculum. There's so many vested interests, and also much of it has to be approved by the Ministry of Education. But what I could do is hire teachers who could teach Confucianism in an engaging way. And to the extent I had any success in that, it's more not through my own efforts, but through the efforts of teachers. So I basically had unlimited resources to hire professors, and some of whom had the task of promoting Confucianism. That's one but again, I wasn't as successful as I'd hoped. The other thing that I was to do was to help internationalize. So China is so complex, but at least in the academic world, there's almost a consensus that we want to engage with the rest of the world. We want to learn from best practices. We know that our academic system is still developing, and we know that the best way to improve is through engaging with the rest of the world. So they wanted me as dean to send students and professors abroad, to invite foreign professors in our faculty, and to have long-term agreements with universities abroad so that we could strengthen our academic foundations and make it more international at Shandong. And also the rankings of universities are so important in China. And one of the ways of improving ranking is to have more international connections. So there's a kind of strong incentive to do so. Yes, so I tried my best for the first 2 years, but then COVID hit. I was in China the whole time. And unfortunately, that brought internationalization to a sudden halt. But now it's coming back. And by the way, you know, we know so much about it was mentioned at this 1 week event that there's some people arguing that we should treat China as a kind of security threat. I mean, China is so complex. You have security people, you know, who view things in those terms, and you have people engaged in commerce who view things primarily in economic terms. But in the academic world, almost everybody. So it's very diverse. There's like, at least in my field, there's liberals, there's socialists, there's Confucians. Very diverse, but they all agree on one thing: the importance of academic freedom, and the importance of and for that we also have to engage with the rest of the world. So what I learned, well, I'm going to end quickly here but I learned how mid-level bureaucracy works. I'll be happy to talk about it. How the Department of Organization selects officials in universities. How the publish or perish approach works in academic. So it's a very strong emphasis. On the one hand, there's increasing censorship. We can talk about why that occurs, and I'll be happy to answer questions. But on the other hand, there's also strong emphasis on academic meritocracy, meaning that professors now face strong pressure to publish or perish, just like they might in, for example, or US or Canada, where I'm from, as well as the UK. I learned a lot about collective leadership. I learned how the party secretary works. I learned, again, there's some distinctive traits from Shandong about how importance of drinking for forging kind of social bonding between people. I learned about the importance of hair dye for leaders. I can talk all about that if you're interested in the question and answer period. And I also learned about the importance. So one thing, I'm going to end here. I really dislike this idea that we should divide the world between democracy and autocracy. It's like it's comparing an ideal with a highly imperfect reality. So in the US, for example, you know, is the US a democracy? Well, obviously as an ideal, that's what people want to have a critical center to improve. But as a highly imperfect reality, well, maybe it's more like a, you know, when my Chinese friends, sometimes it's not one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote, it's a dollocracy. So we should compare like dollocracy with autocracy, if we want to use that, if we want to compare two highly imperfect realities. The Chinese intellectuals that I know and political reformers, they don't pride themselves on we are autocracies. They pride themselves on certain political ideals, two of which are Confucianism and communism. So again, if we want to learn about what we should compare ideals with ideals, you know, democracy with maybe Confucianism or communism, because those are the motivating ideals, or highly imperfect realities. Democracy with autocracy, fine, we can do that. But anyway, what I did learn very much is that both the Confucian traditions and the communist traditions are sincerely held by many intellectuals and students, a great contrast with the 1980s, where intellectuals and students in China, basically there was almost a kind of consensus that we are, what are the ideals that will motivate us? In economic terms, it's US-style capitalism. In political terms, it's US-style democracy. There wasn't much dispute. Of course, formally, it's a communist country, but in terms of what should be the long-term aim, that should be long-term aim. Now, in some sense, it's a much more diverse country in terms of intellectual ideals that serve as motivating forces. And Confucianism and communism have both made huge comebacks in China. I find that fascinating, and I'll be happy to discuss that as well. So let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Don't worry, there's lots more questions for Daniel, so you'll have plenty chance to clap him at the end as well. I'm interested in what you're saying about your very kind of overt political worry, which I share, about demonization of China. Now, I particularly share that concern because of waves of racism against people, including here in the UK, who are racialized as Chinese, right? We saw an upsurge in this during COVID, for example, and this is something we've written about here in the Lao China Institute as well. But at the same time, I am equally or perhaps more concerned about the racialization or minoritized people in China. So you mentioned Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, for example, and the mass incarcerations, of course, that we're all aware of. And as you write and have such a long history of writing about Confucianism in particular, but he'll also talk about it in the context of a combination with a version of communism that, as you say, is sincerely held as an ideal by many people in China. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about what that combination of Confucianism and communism does in China right now and in Xi Jinping's politics. So if it's a sincerely held ideal, grand, what I'm hoping to hear you say a bit more about from your own experience as well is the effects of those ideals within China, and particularly perhaps in relation to this concern about policing of Chineseness with horrific consequences for some, and the perhaps exclusions and repressions that we've talked a lot about this week here in the Lao China Institute, that in my view has kind of come and become justified and perhaps even motivated, if it is indeed a sincerely held ideal, this combination of Confucianism and communism. So I'm hoping, first of all, if you can tell me a little bit about what that construct is. You've told us a bit about the meritocracy already. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about the communism side and how those two combine. And tell us, well, what are the effects? You know, what does that construct do to people in China and to us here?
Okay, thank you, Astrid. Very great points. And by the way, I enjoyed your book on harmony and how often the ideal is misused. I mean, and I don't want to imply that communism and Confucianism do all the work. I mean, there's another strong political tradition in China, before I engage with what you just said, which is legalism, fajia, which has a long history in China, and much of it is under the surface. So the first dynasty of China by Qin Shi Huangdi was more or less founded on legalist principles, but because it was so cruel, for much of subsequent Chinese history, it wasn't really part of the official discourse, but it was nonetheless quite influential. In the 20th century, it came back in a formal way. So the legalist tradition, fajia, is basically the idea that in times of chaos, we need to prioritize social order, and the way to do that is by having uniform laws that are applied regardless of social circumstance and without mercy, and that are backed by harsh punishments. And that often leads to very cruel consequences. But arguably, in times of social chaos, whether it's civil war, like in the Warring States period, or in the 20th century when much of China was in chaos, the kind of Confucian-style soft power is not very effective at dealing with problems. So the past 10 or 15 years, there's also been a revival of this legalist tradition in response to what was felt to be, for example, the huge problem of corruption, which would really pose an existential threat to the whole system before Xi Jinping assumed power. And it was thought that the way to deal with it first and foremost is by using very harsh measures to deal with that. Now, I discuss in my book that it had very bad byproducts or consequences, for example, making public officials, including myself, very conservative and cautious and unafraid to take risks. And sometimes it wasn't even legalist. It was arbitrarily applied, where people just sink into a black hole and when we never find out why. And I should say too that the rise of legalism is also due, I think, partly to the anti-corruption campaign, which led to many political enemies and makes the top leaders fearful, but also partly because of the demonization of China and the rest of the world, and the perception, which I think is grounded in reality to a huge extent, that especially the US wants to curb China's rise and are using whatever measures are available to do that. And that just strengthens the paranoid forces in the security apparatus and makes those of us in academia, for example, who favor more academic freedom, international engagement, and so on, paying the price for that. So that's another reason to counter demonization, is that it would actually help those of us in the academic world who favor much more engagement and academic freedom and freedom of speech more generally. Anyway, so now a little bit about the Confucianism and communist tradition. So they're quite different, right? So, but I will try to say how they might be merged and what are the existing tensions. So the Confucian tradition, it was basically dead for much of the 20th century, with some exceptions like Yang Shuming and Qian Mu. But it really began a huge revival in the 1990s and had many reasons. Like, one is political, that the ruling organization sought legitimacy, not just in the Marxist tradition, but in a much older civilization. And of course, Confucianism is a main political tradition in Chinese history, so that's helped to buttress the kind of values-based legitimacy of the government. No doubt that's part of it, but that's not the only part. In fact, much of the revival of Confucianism came from the bottom. For example, the Qingming festival, with the grave sweeping festival, was actually recreated. It was made into an official holiday in response to tens of millions of people took the day off to go visit and sweep the graves of their ancestors. Finally, the government just said, Swanla, never mind, we're just going to make it into a national holiday. Of course, there's economic reasons too, that for much of the 20th century, Confucianism was viewed as responsible, or at least partly responsible, for China's backwardness. But then it was clear that many countries with a Confucian heritage, such as South Korea and Singapore and Vietnam and so on, generally helped to modernize in a relatively peaceful way. And maybe the Confucian values, like this worldly outlook or commitment to education and self-improvement, savings for future generations, all that can actually contribute to economic development, so long as other conditions are in place. But on the other hand, modernization, especially capitalist-style modernization, makes people more individualistic, and there's a need to affirm social responsibility. And this is where Confucianism is an ethic that can help for that purpose. Confucianism is hugely diverse and a complex tradition, but we can reduce it to a couple of claims. And this is very grossly simplified, but let me go ahead. What is the good life for the Confucians? It's the nourishment of compassionate and harmonious social relations, starting with a family, which are then extended to non-family members. But the further you move from the family, the less intense the love and the less strong sense of responsibility. So it's a kind of graded love. And again, it's a this worldly outlook, hardly anything about the afterlife. But for Confucians, that's the good life. But the best life is the life of a public official serving the community. Again, it sounds, oh, well, who disagrees with that? Well, many people disagree. Plato's Republic, the best life is a philosopher contemplating the forms, and you go back into the cave serving the people as a second choice. For the Confucians, it's the best life is serving the community as a public official. And if that doesn't work, then you can do other stuff, like you retire, go to a mountain, write poetry, become a Taoist. One of the reviews of my book said that, by the way, I'm no longer Confucian, I'm in a Taoist phase, which may well be true. The Confucian tradition, though, when Xi Jinping went to Chufu, I don't think it's all about Xi Jinping. It's still a strong form of collective leadership. In fact, in some areas, we can ask, no matter who's there, these changes would have happened anyway. But anyway, but when he went to Chufu and was handed 2 books about the Confucian tradition, he said, I will read these very diligently. And some people thought, well, this is the turning point. We're moving from Confucianism from communism to Confucianism. It didn't quite happen that way, though. Since then, the Confucian tradition, the comeback, has more or less stalled. It hasn't gone down, but it hasn't continued to increase the way that it had the past 20 years. And except for Shandong province, where Confucianism is still so strong. In fact, sociologists who go study the empirical side of Confucianism, they often go to Shandong to do the work. By the way, one little note. Shandong is the only province where the lucky number is 7. Why is that? Well, because in Chinese, there's this expression, qi shang ba xia. So basically, when you're 57 years old and you're a public official, you still have hope of being promoted. If you're 58, well, you're on the way to retirement. So we would, in our offices, we would fight to have the number 7 or else the license plates in Shandong have a lot of 7s and few 8s. In Shandong, there's a very strong drive to be a public official. Again, partly because the Confucian tradition is so important there, less so arguably in other parts of China. So what about the communist tradition? Well, that began in about, well, it became intensified in 2008 after the financial crisis, when many Chinese intellectuals and reformers saw that capitalism had these huge problems, and how can you make sense of them? And the communist tradition was very helpful for that purpose. But also, one of the huge problems in China is a huge gap between rich and poor. So we need to strongly affirm this egalitarian ways of distributing wealth. And again, the socialist and communist tradition has a lot to offer. Finally, the communist ideal is that advanced machinery would do the socially necessary work and people are free to realize their creative talents. It's a beautiful ideal. And through the development of AI, some intellectuals now, actually, by the way, in AI, whether it's in Canada or the US, people are much more worried about existential threats. In China, quite the opposite. People tend to be more optimistic and think, not now, but in 20 or 30 years, we can imagine a society where AI will do the socially necessary work and people will be free to realize their creative talents. But, of course, for Marx, the state was expected to wither away, but nobody believes that anymore. Marx couldn't think of issues like climate change, couldn't anticipate, or regulation of nuclear weapons. So there's always going to be a need for a pretty strong state to deal with those issues. So the question is, how can we select and promote public officials with above average ability and virtue? Marxism had almost nothing to say about that, but Confucianism has a lot to offer. So this is where Confucianism can help to complement the Marxist tradition. But there's still going to be a tension, because for the Confucians, the best life, I mean, at the end of the day, the good life, I should say, lies in social relations, in starting with the family. But for Marxists, the good life lies in creative work. There's always going to be a tension there. There's not going to be a harmonious resolution of those two ideals. But just when I gave this similar discussion in Shanghai, a young woman came to me and she says, "That's not about 20 or 30 years from now. I experience this tension now. Should I develop my career or focus on my family?" So Confucians might say one and Marxists the other. So there's not going to be a harmonious resolution, I don't believe. But these two ideals, I believe, and I may be wrong, I've been wrong more often than right, actually, in terms of making predictions about the future, but let me go ahead. Next 20 or 30 years, these two ideals will continue to inform China's political ideals. So long as the legalist tradition doesn't crush all these moral ways of thinking about life and about politics.
So in this talk about ideals, I'm quite interested. So we'll see if we can come back maybe a little bit to what these things actually do in Xi's China. But if we stick with the kind of functioning as ideals for a bit, you very kindly mentioned my book on harmony, which I wrote just as Xi Jinping was coming into power. And I think the upshot of what I was trying to say was that the governmental pushing of its particular idea of harmony and the slogans of harmony was becoming so imposing and repressive and pushing it down Chinese people's throat, that if it was ever possible for harmony to function as an ideal in Chinese society, the Communist Party had undermined that possibility, right? By using harmony to motivate violence and repressive policies in places like Xinjiang. But by the time I had kind of finished my fieldwork on harmony, it had collapsed into a joke, right? People were talking about being harmonized by the Chinese censorship and the regime. So my suggestion in the book, which, almost a decade ago now, was that harmony couldn't possibly function as an ideal anymore in China. So I'd like to hear your views on this. Was I wrong about the disappearance and collapse of this attraction of harmony as an ideal? Did it never go away in the first place, as I was suggesting? Or is it that its attraction has been kind of reinstated in some fashion, in combination perhaps with a stronger communist or even legalist ideal? So in today's China, in Xi's China, is there an ideal of harmony that can have any kind of meaning or promise or danger or effect under this push for China to tell its story well?
Okay, thank you. No, I mean, of course, what you write in the book, it's part of the story, and maybe even the main part of the story. But I think we do need to make an important distinction. And the ideal of harmony, it's very central to the Confucian tradition. But one of the most famous sayings in the Analects of Confucius is 君子和而不同, which means that exemplary persons should pursue harmony, but not sameness or diversity, or not sameness or uniformity. So the better translation of he, I think, is diversity in harmony. And this is not just like my, the eccentric. I mean, almost every Chinese intellectual knows this, he er butong, and they wouldn't think of harmony as conformity or sameness. So as you say, it's been misused in practice. And to the extent that harmony is used to deny difference and to repress difference, that's clear misuse. So Confucian ideals, like any other ideals, like democracy and human rights and freedom, can be misused in practice. So we do need to distinguish between the ideals and the vulgarization of the ideals, or the politicalized. And by the way, I don't mean to say that it's only government officials who vulgarize ideals. Also in everyday life, like in Shandong province, Confucian people strongly hold Confucian values typically, but they often vulgarize it. For example, the idea that women should blindly obey men, or students should blindly obey teachers, or I mean, these are clear or adult children should blindly obey their elderly parents. I mean, these are clear vulgarizations of Confucianism. So we need to have intellectuals who could specify and systematize what the ideals are, which could then be used to critically evaluate the vulgarizations. So I think that's an important distinction. But I do think that intellectuals, I mean, never lost sight, typically, of what is the meaning of he, which is diversity and harmony. And some of the metaphors, I mean, they're really widely known in China. I mean, one thing about China, I don't have to tell you this, is how people draw upon history in everyday conversation in a way that is like almost unimaginable for like somebody from Canada. So the uses of he, I mean, they come, the typical metaphors, this is the pre-Qin era, is like a soup that would be bland, but if you need to add salt and diversity so that it tastes good. So it's part of the aesthetic. Through diversity, life is more beautiful. But it's also moral and political. There's in this Zuozhuan, this very ancient text from the pre-Qin era, there was a saying that a ruler should listen to diverse views of political advisors. If there's only one view, which is not, that's tong, that's sameness, as opposed to he, meaning diverse views, that is the road to disaster. So politically, the proper use of harmony is that we should respect and encourage diverse views and perspectives. And if we crush those, then actually it's the road to disaster. So a lot of what you describe in your book, I think it's more the misuses of the term rather than the actual, ideal. And I don't think the ideal ever went away. And those who make fun of it, saying that is that being harmonized, that's clearly a joke. But it's a joke because it's a misuse of the term harmony. I mean, the real meaning of harmony is far from that. Yeah.
So if I can push you a little bit on that then, because my concern, I guess, is then perhaps about the misuse, right? So if harmonious ethnic policies is exemplified by camps, then the difference, the organization of difference in the harmony, or in what is justified by the term harmony, I should say, is a very hierarchical, and some would argue, and I tend to agree with them, a repressive version of harmony, which is not the ideal that you are talking about. So if it is true that this ideal is indeed widely and sincerely held as a harmony that is not repressive, that is genuinely appreciative of different ways of life and views and so on, is it that the party state has betrayed harmony? Has it lost sight of this ideal? Is the party state destroying this ideal, or where can we see it being genuinely held with this quite, I think, stark example of ethnic unity as perhaps an example that can help us think through that role of harmony.
So, I mean, if the language of harmony is used to justify repression and incarceration of minority groups, then obviously it's a misuse, just like democracy and human rights and freedom and other beautiful ideals in Western political theory can and often are misused. And we need to clearly separate the ideal from the misuses. But I think it's worth asking, where are the ideal? Is it just a bunch of rhetoric, or does it affect the reality? I mean, I think that's a good question, and that's harder to answer. So one thing about hierarchy, though, the Confucians are not necessarily against hierarchy if the hierarchies benefit those on the bottom of hierarchies. I mean, the Confucians assume that any society is going to have hierarchies. We need to distinguish between the bad ones that only benefit those on the top and the ones that are potentially justifiable that benefit those also on the bottom, or more so the ones on the bottom. So for example, one of the things that I discuss in my book, and maybe this helps to answer your question a little bit, is the banquets that are so central to serving as a public official in China, where the seating arrangements are very hierarchical, especially in Shandong province. They're done according to age and according to social status, but everybody who's a host is assigned to take care of a guest, and eventually the whole point of these social hierarchies is to generate a sense of kind of social bonding, and well, we can use the word harmony, where there's clear differences between people, but ultimately everybody participates and experiences a sense of joy and feels a sense of bonding in this communal event. So in Shandong province, you clearly have many examples of that sort of uses of harmony that I describe in my book. It might be worth asking whether there are uses of harmony at the highest levels of government that are much closer to the ideal as opposed to distortions of the ideal. I mean, that's a good question. I don't have a ready answer.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm interested in this question of the perhaps gap, and of course, I am equally concerned about the undermining of democracy, right? In many practices that are motivated by the term democracy, and we see a lot of challenges to democratic ideals that, of course, are always also imperfectly lived up to. And I appreciate your example of this, the kind of inclusion of others in the banquet. And my concern is both about the exclusions of that, right? Who doesn't get to come to the banquet? I think is an important question to ask ourselves, but also what are the conditions for inclusion, right? What is the politics of deciding the terms on which inclusion can happen? And I think with regards to the kind of harmonious family as an ideal, there's something that feminist scholars have taught us. It's that the family can also be a space for violence and power abuse, not because they are any less a family. They are perhaps equally much a family as an ideal family that we might imagine for ourselves. I'd like to invite you perhaps to open up before we move on to the question and answer session with the audience, to give us some final thoughts about what the implications and effects of a push of these ideals might be, right? So this combination of Confucianism and communism as joint and perhaps sometimes joint intention ideals are part of Xi Jinping's governmental push to tell China's story well, right? So as China, or the Chinese Communist Party, aims to make China a global knowledge education superpower, as we've talked about during this week, these ideals are part of that going out, of telling China's story well, of contributing to the moral growth and edification, not just of people within China, but in the world. So I was wondering if you could kind of close off our discussion and open up to the audience through commenting a little bit on the implications of that push. So how might it matter for a student, a scholar, a policymaker, a member of the general public here in the UK in the coming few years and for the longer term?
Well, thank you. I mean, I don't think that China has, I mean, China is, I feel whether I use the word China or the Communist Party, all I see is a bafflingly complex country and organization. But anyway, let me continue to use this language. Doesn't have a desire to export its political model abroad. So it's clearly for the Chinese context, because China is a large country. It has its own history and its own national conditions. And at minimum, it means those who want to understand China in its own terms, I think, have to understand at least the political ideals that motivate some of the people, including the intellectuals and the reformers in the system, and the academics and students and so on. So that said, I mean, the Confucian tradition is not distinctly Chinese, right? I mean, neither is the communist tradition. I mean, when Kongzi and others, you know, Mengzi and Xunzi and so on, the great members of this, the term itself is misleading, by the way, because, you know, we think of the Jesus in like central to Christianity, or Buddha central to Buddhism. Kongzi is just one member of a long tradition, and he himself viewed himself as a transmitter, which developed in very diverse ways after him. But it was never meant to be distinctly Chinese. It's meant to anybody who adheres to the ideals and tries to implement those ideals in his or her life can be a Confucian. So it's spread to countries like Korea, and many people in Korea think of themselves as more Confucians than in China. Even in Montreal, where I am now, there's actually a Confucian organization that practices Confucian rituals, and I'm going tomorrow to study it. I was at Duke, and there was a scholar there called Anna Sun, a great sociologist, who's doing a book called Global Confucianism, about the manifestations of Confucianism in different countries. So the idea that Confucian should be viewed as distinctly ethnic Chinese is just another gross, misunderstanding, to the extent that some people have that misunderstanding. The same as communism, right? It's meant to be a universal ideal, and who disagrees with the view that we shouldn't, as humans, be subject to dirty, dangerous, and repetitive and boring labor, and that ideally advanced machinery would do that, and we'd be free to realize our creative talents. So it's also meant to be a global ideal. But the Chinese government, they have so many problems at home, and also there's a strong recognition that whatever works in China may not work abroad because of differences of scale and history and so on, will not try to export those ideals and the manifestations of those ideals to the rest of the world. So people want to come to China. I think it's worth just to, at least trying to learn the language and just set aside, like, don't try to, I was just at a talk where Ruth Heiho, who's a famous educational specialist who works on Chinese education, she said, when you go to China, one little piece of advice: don't talk for 6 months, just listen and try to understand what Chinese people are thinking in their own terms, and instead of always trying to correct people and saying you should do this, do that. I think that's pretty healthy advice.
Thank you. I take a key point from your talk, which is your wonderful optimism about AI. I'm a lot more concerned that we'll be cleaning the toilets while AI paints the pictures and writes the poetry. So I'm hoping that you are correct in this future that perhaps a Confucian communism can lead us towards. We're going to open up to the floor for some comments and questions from the audience. I believe we might have a colleague bringing around some microphones. So we have a comment here at the front, yeah. And then we have two gentlemen over there. If we take these three questions to start off with, and then we'll give Daniel a chance to answer.
Yeah, thanks very
Please,
much.
if you feel comfortable, introduce yourself with your name and affiliation if you're happy to do so.
Okay, hi. Thanks very much, David. My name's Yao Ming. I'm not in this field. I'm more of a layman. My day job, I'm an accountant. My question is from what I've read, in the past, Confucianism was a bit out of favor for quite a while, I think around the 60s and 70s. But now it's back in vogue from what I've heard. What's the difference? Could you elaborate, like maybe do a compare and contrast sort of exercise on the Confucianism that is in vogue now in China?
Thank you. We'll take 3 questions before I hand over to you to answer those, Daniel.
Okay.
Gentleman over here, yeah.
Hi, the name's Richard, not affiliated. Not sure you're going to remember my question. Oh, you seem to be writing down. That's great. So an observation then and a few questions. Observation, there's a lot of literature now, and it's pointed not substantially at China, about how despotism in history has failed where it has not been attached to some kind of consequential ideology. And China was kind of floating free. This relates back to the earlier question, I think, without an ideology. Confucianism was gone, etc. It's now being reintroduced by the state, and maybe not to push outside of China, but as apparently these things are good for controlling people. So maybe that's why it's back. My questions are, one, in the reviews of your book, the FT and others talk about academics like yourself as being considered in China as cute trophies and as opportunities for spreading the kind of story about Confucianism and about things like the wonderful tradition of Marxism. Do you feel at all you might be a victim of that? And finally, how far could you actually step out of line in anything that you say before you would be out of seat? I went to the wonderful speech earlier this week, the panel here at King's, about what you can't say in China. And I'm surprised that you can be still in seat unless you're being very, very careful.
And then we have a question from a gentleman in the same row. Thank you.
Some simple kind of critics might raise. How would you answer them? Analogies.
Sorry, I can't hear. I can't hear.
Is that better? Some simple analogies here that Western critics could raise, and how would you talk around this? To think of totalitarian states like China as prioritizing burning out adverse feedback loops, and especially whistleblowers, basically creating humans into a bit more of a busy bee kind of coerced, muzzled, sort of brutally efficient sort of production economy with potential global public bad risks to the rest of the world if they become big public states. This is one narrative. How would you answer that? And also the general point that if you muzzle lots of debate and feedback, it could be seen as being like earthquakes rather than constant readjustments. In the democratic venture capitalist model, you have endless little debates and readjustments every second of every day. Maybe in big police states, you have rather more like a buildup of a lot of tensions and misperceptions, and then lots of earthquakes, whether they be financial or business or scientific or technological or political or political.
Thank you very much for those questions from the audience. Over to you, Daniel.
Okay, thank you for the great questions and comments. About China, so for most of the 20th century, as mentioned, Confucianism was viewed as a feudal, backward, patriarchal, and as responsible for China's backwardness relative to the West, and which were viewed as more modern, obviously. And much of that, though, was very vulgarized views of Confucianism. For example, that filial piety requires blind obedience to elderly parents. I mean, clearly, anybody who knows anything about the classics knows that that's a distortion. I mean, even the texts that are being used now in primary schools. There's one called Di Zi Gui, and it has this, and it's designed for young children and to try to teach them to be filled. But then there's a section in there. Well, what happens if you're and that's used in tens of millions. That's used by tens of millions of students now in schools in China. There's a section, well, what happens if your parent does something morally wrong? What do you do? Well, the first thing you do is you should criticize them and tell them. You should remonstrate. Well, what if that doesn't work? Well, then you wait till they're in a good mood and you try again. And what if that doesn't work? Well, then you cry and work on their emotions. So it's a very detailed account of, so the Confucians say, first and foremost, you owe your allegiance to the moral way, to the Tao, which is used as a critical standard to evaluate the status quo. So the idea that Confucianism is good for controlling people, which was, that's not the point. It's an ethic that's meant to elevate people and inspire people. Anyway, so what happened in eventually 1960s? That was like the bottom of the tradition of anti-traditionalism. When in the middle of this was the Cultural Revolution, when there was a campaign to denounce Kongzi, and actually many young people were forced to read it. But some of them, who had their own minds, even in these terrible conditions of the Cultural Revolution, where they're not supposed to think your own thoughts, well, then they realize it's not as bad as officially advertised. And there's one famous case called Jiang Qing, who's a leading political Confucian now, has his own Confucian academy in remote Guizhou province, independently funded by entrepreneurs. And he realized once this is actually quite inspiring. And once the conditions opened up, then he could begin to promote Confucianism. So this is very interesting that they were forced to read to denounce it, and then they realized that it's actually quite inspiring. So to go a little bit to the point about censorship, there is, and I document this in great detail, there is a rise of censorship in China. And I think it's related to, well, two things at least: the anti-corruption campaign, which makes the leaders more paranoid, and the demonization of China, which strengthens the paranoid forces of the security apparatus. But even then, there's actually, in terms of teaching, it's much more free than people would think on the outside. I teach political theory. I could, what I did is I would take themes like freedom and harmony, and I would use one Western thinker and one Chinese thinker, and I could discuss them in great detail. Of course, I know there's some limits, like I wouldn't have a open discussion on what happened on June 4th in Beijing. But on the other hand, I might not do that anyway, even if I was in the West, because it's not relevant for me as a political theorist, where I care more about the ideas at the end of the day. That said, even the teaching, though, is becoming a bit more problematic when students are beginning to report on teachers if they say politically problematic things. So obviously that's a horrible trend, and all we can do as intellectuals is document them and criticize them and hope that things will improve in the future, and also suggest conditions that will allow for improvement, which is partly what I try to do in the book. So, well, about cute trophies, I'm not sure what that means. So at the end of the last chapter in my book, it's called In Defense of Symbolic Leadership. And basically, I realized that I wasn't cut out to be a dean, again, because I lacked this capacity for hard work that other public officials had in my university. And that I really, at the end of the day, I want to go back, which is where I am now, as an academic who just reads and writes mainly and teaches. So my wife used the term, became a faculty panda, which I guess is similar to the idea of the cute trophy. Well, why did I stay there? Well, because there wasn't yet a replacement, and also I'm quite frank in the book. I was told that at that time 2 Canadians who are known as the 2 Michaels were incarcerated. I think in response to the incarceration of a Huawei official by Canada, which was basically following the American lead on this. And they said, well, if you go now, people are going to think that you left because of the increased repression against Canada. So just stay for a bit. So I agreed to stay for a bit also for that political reason. But eventually I left, and now we're on good terms. So there's much more, I think, notwithstanding the increased repression and censorship, there's still a lot of room to engage and to get some positive things done. And again, almost all academics are on the same side on this issue of freedom of speech and international engagement. It's almost uniform support for that in the academic world. So we should keep that in mind, I think. Now, about how a dictatorship and totalitarian regimes and so on can have problems where because the problems are repressed and then they can boil up. Now, yeah, I mean, that's partly true. And so what happened in China during COVID, we had 2 wonderful years where we felt it was the luckiest place in the world to be. The rest of the world was poisoned. But in 2020 and 2021, after this debacle in Wuhan, basically the measures worked in containing the pandemic, and we could travel over China, which is a huge continent, right? Probably bigger than Europe and probably more diverse as well. So I did more traveling in those 2 years than I had in the previous 15 years, because the measures were working quite well, and there was strong support of the people. So there was a kind of legalist views because it's a time of social chaos, but there was a lot of social trust between the people and the government. But then it all went sour in 2022. And eventually blew up in a very unhealthy way. So clearly, there's a need to have more, not just feedback mechanisms, but more opportunity, more room for public discussion of problems before they blow up. And we're in this case where China literally went from like the best place in the world to one of the worst ones almost overnight in 2022. So that's, I mean, in my book, this book is more about my experience serving as dean, but my earlier two more recent books, it's much more detailed about how to make political meritocracy more effective. We argue that there's a need for many more democratic practices at lower levels of government, much more personal freedom and rooms for feedback and consultation. And only then could a kind of political meritocracy be more effective for the long term. It's a very critical view, and actually probably now the past few years, it's 2 steps backward, 1 step forward maybe. I thought we were moving towards some sort of constitutional meritocracy a few years ago, but we're not moving now in that direction, fortunately.
Thank you. We can take another round of questions from the audience. You have? Yeah, gentleman over here. Thank you.
Hello, hear me?
Yeah, hello.
Hi, I'm Arthur. I'm a philosophy MA student here at King's. Just a quick question. Earlier on in the talk, you briefly touched on how legalism might be kind of in the background influencing the anti-corruption campaign. And I was just wondering, are there any like intellectuals or pundits in the modern Chinese intellectual space espousing legalism? And if so, is it a modern form of legalism that differs in some ways from a classical form, or is that just a misplaced question? I'm just curious if that is a school of thought that there's a lot of, I guess, movement and dynamism around. Thanks.
And then at the back.
Thank you. David Tobin, University of Sheffield. I had the pleasure of hearing you speak in Nottingham, Ningbo a number of years ago. Unlike yourself, I had very different experiences in China, which is good. But whilst working there, we were instructed their books with China in the title. It was obviously an impingement on academic freedom. We couldn't really do our work. So I really want to sort of quiz you on that notion that all academics, Chinese or otherwise, are for freedom and academic freedom. I wonder what you would say to my colleague Rahela Dahout, who is currently in prison for life for being a Uyghur ethnomusicologist. SOAS has put out a statement about her because she was working on a research project there. What would you say to her, who has been imprisoned for her work? What would you say about the fact there has been no pushback from within China about that? And what would you say to a scholar like myself, who's very eager to work and collaborate with Chinese colleagues, but cannot because they're being put in prison for writing about their lives?
Another question from this gentleman over here.
Some more curveball, tough questions. See how you kind of answer the typical sort of Western criticisms. A lot of people in the West would see China as more of a relational system, like roots of a tree, relative to a Western system as relatively more principles, ideologies, but really continually renegotiated contracts and sort of compromises through votes and through endless think tanks, policy suggestions, which obviously China refuses. So the tree root model might work fantastic in a family or local sort of early stage society, but it might prove to be less effective, even quite dangerous to a bigger global sort of massive police state, have a bigger public bads, particularly when a big police state could be the ideal way to subvert global economies, sort of economic warfare type of tactics, intellectual property rights, 10 different types of abuse, which is basically airbrushed out of Chinese discussion. Obviously, the Taiwan issue, Taiwan pretty much proves you don't need to be slightly communistic authoritarian at all to be even much more per capita successful than China is. But particularly this sort of curious idea that China clings to, that Taiwan has any slightly remote, credible historical connection. Well, there probably maybe another 100 colonies through history that would have quite a comparable historical claim from the ex-colonial masters, and nobody serious suggests they have any claim. So what's the difference?
Right, lots of questions packed in there. Daniel, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, the first question about legalism and whether intellectuals defend it, I mean, I think that's a good question. And it is actually becoming part of the discourse. Again, there's even this term rufa, which means like Confucian legalism, is used sometimes by academics. And there's a great book called, I think it's called The Confucian Legalist State, by Zhao Dingxing. He was at the University of Chicago. Now he's at Zhejiang. And there's also Chinese translation, a very good one. So some intellectuals are thinking in a historical way about to what extent legalism influenced the actual practices in imperial China. And also some intellectuals now are thinking about legalism in a more normative way. Like one is Bai Tongdong at Fudan University. He's a Confucian. He has a book, which I don't like the title. It's called Against Political Equality by Princeton University Press. It's a great book in defense of Confucianism as a kind of universal ethic. But recently he's working on legalism, and he tries to show how it might be actually quite helpful in times of chaos. But again, only as a short-term measure for dealing with chaos. But even then, the legalists were not in favor of arbitrary rule. I mean, the laws should be in place. They should be uniform, clearly understood, and transparent, and transmitted to everybody. So everybody has a good understanding. And ideally, people would have a good understanding so that there wouldn't be a need to use too much, if any, harsh punishments. So the anti-corruption campaign, it was actually sometimes justified, at least unofficially, when I spoke to people as a kind of legalist way of dealing with chaos. But to repeat myself, some of the measures were not legalists at all. I mean, they were again, it was just very arbitrary, and people sometimes disappearing into a black hole and not knowing why. In fact, if it was a more pure legalism that informed, and actually that's part of what the intellectuals are saying, that legalism is used as a kind of critical way of evaluating some of the legalist-inspired things that were done or that were misusing legalism. About academics, again, academics care about intellectual freedom, and I haven't met any who argues otherwise, whether it's a Confucian or socialist or liberal. There's a kind of consensus there. It's not academics who put people in prison. Academics are on the other side. So we as academics need to strive hard to fight for academic freedom and pursue academic engagements, including international engagements, to the extent it's possible. Of course, there are some issues where it's very dangerous to articulate open criticism in China, and obviously, well, if practically we need to focus on other issues. But it's not academics who put people in prison. You know, it's very interesting that and you wouldn't find actually academics criticizing people in prison because it's viewed that they can defend themselves in any way. So that's, I mean, at least as far as I know, it's quite rare for academics to criticize people who are in prison. There's diverse forces in China, and the people who put people in prison are not the ones typically, at least that I would work with. Well, the other question about economic warfare in Taiwan, I mean, look, whatever we think about Taiwan's history, it's not going to go away as an issue. And it's clear that so long as Taiwan doesn't declare formal independence, it won't, there's not likely to be a war, and the issue can be postponed almost indefinitely. I worry not so much about mainland China, but about these really dangerous forces in the US that are pushing Taiwan to declare formal independence, which might well trigger a war. That's what I worry about much more than anything coming out of mainland China.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up a little bit on your response there with regards to the academic freedom. So I think you're correct, is my guess, in your point that our academic colleagues also care about academic freedom, at least most of them, at least to some degree. And I don't see any reason to believe that Chinese academic colleagues value academic freedom any less than academic colleagues here in the UK. But I'm not sure that was really the audience question suggestion. I guess my interpretation or my concern isn't that somehow Chinese academics wouldn't care about being able to have academic freedom. More, I guess, a question of if what you're suggesting, Daniel, is that there's this meritocratic system where these values somehow permeate up the food chain, as it were, and put at the top of hierarchies and in those positions of decision-making power people who also share these ideals, right? Because I think that's your argument, right? That these values are genuinely held, not just by academics who are prevented from exercising them and voicing them, but also genuinely held by people in positions of more decision-making ability, right? Including ones who might be in a position to send people to prison. So can I pass that question back to you, Daniel, that assuming that we accept your suggestion that Chinese academics also care about, in a genuine way, academic freedom, what about all that rest? How does someone like our colleague Dr. Dawood end up in prison if indeed those values are genuinely held and valued beyond academia?
Well, thank you, but I don't mean to argue that the strong commitment to academic freedom is held by all members of the Chinese political system. I was restricting my claim to academics. And obviously, there are many in the political system who, especially in the security and military apparatus, who hold different values. And so that I certainly didn't mean to imply that academic freedom was used as a standard for promoting people in the political system outside of academia. You know.
Okay, so that's not part of the kind of Confucian values that you're talking about, or the communist values.
Well, I think Confucians do value freedom, because to value diversity and pluralism, this idea of diversity in harmony, you can only have that if you have substantial freedom in society. And it's not just a new thing. In China, there's been this perpetual tension between the Confucians, who value much more decentralized forms of government with more de facto personal freedom, and the legalists, who favor strong centralized government that doesn't allow for dissent. That is an old tension in China. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if we have any more questions from the audience or comments. Yeah, this.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm Jo Yang from Shandong University, and this is my first month in London. I think it's very diversity, and I love London diversity culture, and there are many voices from different aspects. And as new international students, as an experienced person, I'd like to ask for, may I take the representative for the international students, because you are a very good example for the bridge builder for the different culture, make that or diversity come true. Because I also last month I visit the Oxford University, and the next February I will go to the Cambridge University. Their politics side, because my major in international relations, they have many different voices, and also I start to know the politics and international relations has their own emotions. So I think you are ready to meet many problems that have unfriendly wars. Even I exchange my ideas with my Indian friends and classmates, and they also meet some problems that the academic side is not a real situation. It's like unfriendly or but it's not good for academic and for the political field. So it's not some good solutions. I'd like to give you example. For example, we all to study, to teach the modules like how to think and intention other sides, big powers, strategy thinking. Why not to change other words? How to make a dialogue with the big power, how to solve problem together. And if you know each other, completed, so that can put in harmony. But in academic version, to that kind of model, I don't think is a good way to push our globally, think globally, act locally, that's harmony. So could you please give us some advice from student side, or as a leadership, or as a teacher, tutor, dean to our students and teachers? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have one question here at the front. Thank you.
Hello, hi there. Thomas White from the Lao China Institute. So my question builds on some of what Astrid was getting at earlier, that I'm not sure we ever got an answer to, but it also builds on this idea of communism and Confucianism. So communism, Chinese communism had a theory of nationality and a theory of nationality autonomy. Whether or not that was ever realized is another question. But what you've touched on a little bit, but I want to push you a little bit more. What does Confucianism have to say to the diversity of China and the governance of that diversity? What does Confucianism promise to China's minorities? And is there not a danger that China's minorities will see Confucianism as a kind of Hanhua? Okay, and is there a danger of the conflation of Confucianism and China that keeps coming up in your talk? Is that not potentially problematic as well? Thank you.
Thank you. And then a third question here at the front. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I'm Charlotte Goodburn from the Lao China Institute. I have a slightly different sort of question. You've had a lot of broadly political questions, and I want to ask a more broadly philosophical question. You stressed the differences, I think, between Western political and philosophical traditions, and I liked your example of, the Platonic ideal of the philosopher in the cave versus the Confucian ideal of the official serving the people. But I'm aware that in the last, 8-10 years, there's been a lot of work in philosophy that tries to bring together traditional Confucian virtues with Aristotelian virtues and argue that these are not as different as we might have thought. And I would be very interested in your views on that, and in particular on the implications of that for, whether does that mean we have less of a clash of civilizations than we might think, or do you not agree that these similarities between the Aristotelian or Western ethics and virtues are there with the Confucian virtues? Thank you.
Right, so back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you. Big questions and a bit very difficult to answer briefly. about advice for teachers and students. Well, so I'm not there. I mean, I just think at most important thing is to listen, you know, and at least in the beginning, and try to understand, not just, you know, try to understand the motivating ideals. I mean, that's one thing that when we talk to academics and intellectuals and students, whether it's in China and the West, people tend to have our discussions about values and what are the underlying values that motivate them. And I think it's important to try to understand the values with our interlocutors before we launch into criticism or defense of our own ideals. That's my little humble view. And in terms of just the reading of what should be done about China, I mean, because it's so complex and diverse, it's very important to have diverse sources of reading. So for me, in English, I mean, I think the best, it's important to have diverse sources of media as well. You know, for example, not just Financial Times or New York Times, but also South China Morning Post, which has much more on the other side. And in the Chinese media, I subscribe to groups by Confucians, by liberals, by and by socialists, and I try to get much more information that way. I think that's very important, is to get, notwithstanding censorship, it's still possible to get diverse views in both in China and outside of China. About Confucianism and minority. So one of the things about Confucianism is that it's not exclusionary, right? I mean, and historically, you can be a Confucian and a Buddhist, or a Confucian and a Taoist, and at different times in your life, you can be one or the other. And even if you visit temples in China, it's often this mixture of Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism and folk religions. So it's not meant to say that this is this Confucian ethic. It's Chinese. Again, it's not Chinese. It's a universal ethic, just like Christianity or Buddhism or Taoism. And it can be, and in fact often is, combined with other ethical systems, both in terms of institutions and also in terms of self-understanding. So it's definitely not meant to say that, you know, people in minority regions who believe, for example, in Buddhism or in Islam, need to become Confucians. I mean, nobody argues for that. That would be crazy view. By the way, I did even Chufu, which is basically the ground zero for Confucian culture. It has a Muslim minority neighborhood. And I did a chapter with actually a descendant of Kongzi called Kong Xingfang on the spirit of Chufu. And we interviewed them, and they said, well, yes, we are committed Muslims, but we also adhere to certain Confucian values, like the importance of education and caring for future generations. And that wasn't viewed as a kind of huge source of tension. So it's this tolerant and inclusive form of Confucianism that I think is much more faithful to the underlying ideals, and that hopefully can and that should have more influence. About Confucian Aristotelian virtues, I mean, that's true. There's a lot of academic work on that, very good academic work, which shows some striking similarities. For example, that neither is really utilitarian or deontological, but places a lot of emphasis on virtue ethics and on character development. But still, there are some tensions that we can't deny. And this is one of the things about Confucianism, is that from its very earliest days, it has valued the family as a source of morality, where we learn about morality and where morality is often felt in its most intense way, and love and compassion is felt in its more intense way, which we then extend outside the family, but in diminishing degrees. Whereas Aristotle, I mean, for Aristotle, the family was a sphere of necessity, and it's there because it's necessary, but the good life lies outside the family. That's a radically different view than the Confucian view about the good life. So, I mean, I think that it's worth recognizing some huge differences as well.
Okay, I think maybe we'll take a last round of questions. We have one over here, at least, and then.
Thank you. I'm Tommy. I study international political economy here at King's. I want to hear your comment about the ethical pragmatism in China. During Mao Zedong era, the Confucianism was not popular, as you said. People said it made the country weak. But now the social order is better, the condition in China is better. People now love Confucianism again. I'm asking, if one day China face another political crisis, do you think people will hate Confucianism again? Or do you think the Mao Zedong era, the hate against Confucianism in Mao Zedong era was just a historical blip, and that inside Chinese people, they just inherently Confucian? Thank you.
Question over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Wen Yuan, and I'm a current, I hope I still can be considered as the student of Lao China Institute because I'm about to graduate. And my question is, in the past, in China, we do have campaign about kick down and beat down the Confucian thoughts. In Chinese, we call it as 打倒孔老二. But recently, we not even recognize the Confucian thought, but also we even want to introduce it to the world. And I would like to know what caused that such big attitude change about Confucian thought, and what can we learn about this kind of change? Thank you.
Do you have any future views? What would be your sort of best guess scenario for, say, 10 years out? And what would be your sort of nightmare scenario 10 years out? And your very best scenario 10 years out?
Thank you very much. What an excellent question to finish on as well for Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you. I mean, very interesting questions. I like this question of if there's another crisis, will people hate Confucianism again? Again, my predictions about the future typically are wrong, so please take what I say with a grain of salt. But I think that is different because now there's widespread recognition that Confucianism is a very diverse tradition and that it affects people's lives and ethical lives as a kind of everyday practice, and that it's not just something that's driven by or that's publicized and promoted by the government. So even if there is a crisis in China, people wouldn't necessarily blame Confucianism. There might be some turn from Marxism because it's still the official governing value system, as you know, and maybe also some turn against legalism. But I don't expect that the Confucian comeback will kind of fade away if there is a political crisis. And there's a lot of good empirical work. There's a very good book called the Confucian Foundations of Learning, which showed how even in the Cultural Revolution, and she's a development psychologist at Brown University, even in the Cultural Revolution, the Confucian values often influenced the way that the families operated, even when they were encouraged to denounce each other, which is more of a kind of a legalist thing. So anyway, why Confucianism changed? Well, first of all, I don't think that China wants to export Confucianism to the rest of the world. I mean, the Confucius Institutes were labeled that way, but it was more like the Goethe Institute. You know, they're not meant to promote Goethe, right? It's just a kind of convenient label to capture one important strand of China's culture and history. I mean, we did have some dialogues between Confucians and Ubuntu, for example, in the Confucian students in South Africa. We compared Confucian and Ubuntu ideas of harmony. There's some of that, but mainly the Confucian institutes are there to promote language. I think the big mistake was embedded them within universities because obviously universities are committed first and foremost to academic freedom, at least certain issues. But anyway, we can talk about that at some. So, but why did Confucianism become dominant? Again, there are political reasons, economic reasons, psychological reasons, and even the sorts of experiences about the Cultural Revolution, as mentioned, where people were encouraged to read it, but I guess the smart ones, once they read it, they realized it's not as bad as officially advertised, and once the conditions open up, they could actually promote Confucianism. It's quite a fascinating phenomenon. 10 years out, it's easier to predict what the most pessimistic scenario would be. If there's a war in Taiwan, that would just, the best case scenario is that China's development would be, would be set back for decades. And the worst case scenario, which is quite likely, is that it would be some sort of global war. That's so dangerous, and it's very important not to cross the red lines. Whatever we think about Taiwan's history and so on, The idea that, you know, there should be any encouragement from the West to push for formal independence in Taiwan is just a complete recipe for disaster that may well lead to this nightmare scenario. The best case scenario, well, so my first job was in Singapore in the early 90s, and it was terrible time in Singapore. Actually, academically, it was much more repressive than China is now. I couldn't teach John Stuart Mill. I was told you can't teach feminism. And the head of my department was a member of the ruling party, and he literally went through my reading list, and not just mine, but the whole department of political science. You can't do this, can't do that, and like 15 people left in 1 year. Now Singapore, 10 or 15 years later, anyway, was much better. Basically, you could talk about almost anything except for Singaporean politics. Even that, it's better than it used to be, and it's much more academically meritocratic. And there's much more, because of social media, much more freedom of speech than there used to be. Now, China, I think, can move towards the Singapore model, which becomes more meritocratic at the top, with lots of democratic practices at lower levels of government, much more space for freedom of speech. And there's so much demand for that in China. I mean, the intellectuals, not just academics, you know, it's lawyers and artists and journalists who feel kind of suffocated by this increased censorship, and that's not healthy for the long term. And eventually, I'm almost convinced that the government, at the end of the day, does care about, let's call them intellectuals, and will allow for more opening in the future. But my optimism has often not proved to be accurate in the future. I regret to say, in the past, I mean.
Well, let's hope that in this case, your optimism turns into reality. I think we'd all love to see a more open future for China.